My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War, and we're thrilled to have a guest today, Stephan Kramer from Germany, who's going to be speaking about confronting rising anti-Semitism and the right-wing hate groups in Germany. For those of you unfamiliar, our center is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank, and we do work on education, research, and outreach related to a variety of security threats, current and future, often with a policy perspective. And with this in mind, we're particularly thrilled to have Stephan with us. He's the president of the State Domestic Intelligence Service in Thuringia, Germany. He's responsible for collecting and analyzing information on extremist, terrorist, and anti-Semitic activity, and has played a key role in multiple investigations and prosecutions. Previously, he served as the director of the European Office on Anti-Semitism of the American Jewish Committee and Secretary General of the Central Council of Jews in Germany. As he's explained, quote, right-wing extremism is the most vital threat that we face at the moment in the Federal Republic of Germany. So thank you, everybody. We'll hear from Stephan in a second. We have a Q&A box in Zoom. So when we get to the Q&A section after Stephan presents, then feel free to drop your questions into that box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So thank you all for joining us. And Stephan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for the very warm welcome, and also to Emily, who is providing the technical support. It's great to be with you and give you a short overview on my work in Germany. I'm in that position with the domestic intelligence since 2015, so I have had a little time of experience to collect. I want to start right away with anti-Semitism and the situation that we're facing at the moment in Germany. The problem is, and you will figure that out while I'm going through all the phenomena, that what I'm talking about is not simply something that is an isolated event in a country, but it's rather a globalized world, not only for the good guys, but also the bad guys. Right now, we're having an anti-Semitism in Germany, which is clearly on the rise. Only in the last 2 years, in 2020, we had like 16% rise. In 2021, we had 29% rise. And I proclaim for the future, specifically taking the pandemic situation, QAnon, conspiracy theories, and others, we will have even a larger amount of rise in the coming months to see when people that shoot on those theories realize that is something that they can download and actually load to the Jewish community. Interesting enough, 38% of the anti-Semitic events happen in the internet. I'm not claiming that the internet is a bad thing and we should put it back into the bottle like genie, but I'm saying that without the internet and the digitalization and the globalization of the world, I think we would have probably less problems with those phenomena that I'm going to describe. Interesting enough, I am giving you a little bit more about the statistics with anti-Semitism in Germany from the roughly 400 suspects that were identified in the years 2020 to 2021. We figured out that 93% of those suspects, we're talking about the light field, not the ones that couldn't get caught actually, but of those that could get caught, 93% are over the age of 30, 17% are females, and 90% are male. Interesting that the second largest age spectrum in anti-Semitism of this group were the people between 14 to 17, so the rather young ones. And to add, the clearance rate, which the police could claim was lower than 50%, it was around 46%, which shows you that we have at least a dark field of about 50% with the actions of anti-Semitism in Germany in those 2 years. Another very interesting spot, which we have to deal with also in the present situation, and later on when I talk about right-wing extremism and hate groups, is that from those identified suspects that I just described, around 46% have never been on the radar screen for the police or the internal domestic intelligence services, which means we have like half of all the perpetrators and suspects who are basically new to the issue. We've seen a similar problem with the immigration hate waves that we had in 2015, where afterwards the police identified suspects and then figured out that more than 50% of those who for the first time attacked asylum seekers and refugees in Germany, more than 50% were never before seen by the police in these matters or any other crime, and so basically brand new on the screen for committing these violent attacks. Anti-Semitism is still on the rise. All the different forms, primary and secondary anti-Semitism. Interesting enough, we have a very different legal and school system in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism, educational programs all over the place, not only in school, but also adult education programs. But still in Germany, we have a situation that anti-Semitism is on the rise and existing like in any other European country. And one of my former bosses at the Jewish community used to say, look, when you once had a pneumonia, you overcame it, you cured it, and you start coughing again. Everybody gets on alert because, of course, the risk of being again infected and catching pneumonia is very high. And I admit to say that Germany had a very bad pneumonia between 33 and 45. And so when Germany today is coughing again with the rising anti-Semitic incident numbers, we have to be very much on alert. That leads over to the next group that I want to talk about. We're talking about right-wing neo-Nazi hate groups in Germany. Yes, I want to admit at the beginning that we also have rising problems with left-wing extremist groups, mostly operating in the environmental discussion issues at the moment. But I want to focus today in my presentation on the neo-Nazi right-wing hate groups that we are dealing with at the moment in Germany. And I want to start with a very interesting survey from the Alfred Landecker Foundation from 2021, which figured out that 91% of all the adults on the internet in Germany have been victims or at least addressed by hatred and incitement on the internet. And every second between the age of 18 and 35 was a personal target of this hatred and incitement. And interesting enough, 52% of the female and 35% of the male who have been targets of this hatred and incitement try to somehow cover their tracks and anonymize themselves from the internet, leading to the very interesting fact and experience that, of course, we have freedom of speech like you have in the US and Germany. You have basic rights which should guarantee your right of participating in a political process, which means, of course, also in discussions on the internet. But the big question is, what are these principal and basic rights, freedom of speech, worth when you address your opinion on the internet and the only thing that you basically face is hatred and incitement, which is not only a hatred and incitement in a digital world, but also transforms into hatred and incitement in the analog world. We had very many cases in which hatred and incitement started on the internet, but transformed into the analog world and got very personal, very nasty, and in some cases even ended up in murder cases. The right-wing extremist scene in Germany is long experienced and well known, and I admit that I would call it rather a terrorist scene since the 1960s, which means in the former Western old Germany Republic, and then afterwards the unification in 1989, also in the whole of Germany. We're talking about hundreds of attacks against individuals, but also against groups perpetrated by right-wing neo-Nazis and extremists, rather played down by the official security authorities in the magnitude of relevance and the violence, and never actually called a form of terror until lately, when we experienced with the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, over a period of 10 years, 10 murders at former immigrated people to Germany, perpetrated by Nazis and organized by Nazis, and very lately incidents and attacks against the synagogue in Halle, for example, or against Muslim people in Hanau, or one of our state representatives, a conservative politician who was basically shot on his porch in his private home. And I could add more individual cases to prove that we have a dramatic increase of violence, and specifically into violence against individuals. The names of the groups that we're dealing with today are various names that you might be familiar, because you have the same groups in the United States: the White Aryans, Ku Klux Klan, Combat 18, the Hammerskins, just to name a few. Groups that originated in the United States, in Northern America, and found their way also to Europe in the last 30 years, and are still very active and are also connected with each other, which means and leads to the conclusion that I addressed at the beginning. We're talking about a globalized world when we speak about Nazism, neo-Nazism, right-wing extremism, and especially also when we look on right-wing rock concerts, mixed martial arts contests, which are not just singly events in certain European countries, but spreading across the European continent, north to south, west to east. I'm talking from Spain, Portugal, all the way to Russia, actually, from the Scandinavian countries in the north, Norway, Sweden, Finland, all the way to the south in Italy, to the Balkans and other areas. But as I mentioned before, with clear and very tight connections to their brotherhoods also in the United States. We're seeing right now in Germany that these right-wing groups are ideologically oriented groups, but even further, I call right-wing extremism and terrorism in Germany a form of lifestyle in the meantime. And when we speak about these right-wing rock concerts, I'd like to remind you that the first one started in 2016 called Unterwasser die Schweiz, Switzerland, very tiny village, organized by Thuringian right-wing neo-Nazis from Germany, which brought together numbers like 12,000, 14,000 neo-Nazis from across Europe, who had a very nice weekend celebrating their right-wing neo-Nazi ideas, but attending a very well received neo-Nazi rock concert. And if we speak about mixed martial arts contests, we're seeing in the meantime a large number of these contests organized European-wide, where neo-Nazis travel across international borders to attend these competitions, fight with each other, hit each other, of course, but the predominantly idea of these mixed martial arts events, as well as the concerts, is to live their lifestyle, meet each other, convince each other that they are on the right side of life, and furthermore train their mixed martial arts sports in order to prepare for a fight in the future against police, against military, against the political opponents on the streets. So what we face right now is a situation that we have neo-Nazi armies preparing themselves for a possible takeover. We're far away from that at the moment, but you had your storm of Capitol Hill. We had a little storm on the German Reichstag in Germany a couple of months ago. We've seen veterans, we've seen reservists being part of these groups, using their perfect training on the military scale for basically involving to creating these underground armies and waiting for the day of X when they might successfully take over the government or turn down basically our democracy. One very famous group that we're dealing with in Germany at the moment, not in numbers, but quite for a long time, are the so-called Reichsbürger or Reichscitizens, compared with independent citizens, a group that you have in a comparable way called sovereign citizens in the United States, people who basically neglect and ignore the existence, the very existence of the Federal Republic of Germany, using historical indifferentias and questions how they doubt that legally this Federal Republic of Germany was ever created, having kind of very weird ideas and arguments to prove that they have their own statesmanship, their own citizenship. So to say, people that usually you would ask to see medics, psychologists, and others, but we have experienced in the past years that these groups armed themselves. And when in 2016 the first policeman was shot through the door while they were trying to take legal weapons from those Reichsbürger and sovereign citizens, politicians in Germany understood that this is a far more severe problem that we have to deal with. And in the meantime, we have nationwide more than 25,000 of these Reichsbürger, Reich citizens who are on their way of establishing their own states and establishing their own ideas about citizenship, and certainly not accepting and neglecting democracy and our existing state. Just today, we had an arrest of a 75-year-old sovereign citizen who was part of a larger group that we've been after for the last 6 months. She was actively planning to overthrow the government, murder some of our distinguished secretaries of health and interior, as well as providing sabotage to the critical infrastructure, which you can imagine in a situation of energy crisis and several other crisis subjects that we're facing right now in Germany, something that could cause a lot of disturbance and is considered to be a very, very dangerous situation. We got her locked up today, but this is only one of several other groups that is acting. I myself was on a public event last night in a small town on the countryside, being invited to speak about these Reichsbürger and sovereign citizens, and saw myself at the end a group of almost 60 people listening very carefully and being very interested to learn more about these people and these groups and how dangerous they are. And of course, among these 60 people, 4 of the Reichsbürger were present and tried to overcome the whole evening and basically spread their their poison even among those. I've just described to you a certain amount of potential which we see right now in Germany. We're talking about, when we speak about right-wing extremists, of about 35 to 40,000 people who are clearly right-wing extremists. Some 13,000 of these 40,000 are even violence-oriented, which means have weapons or have a very low rate of, let's say, resistance to use weapons to speak about their political ideas and provide terrorist attacks in our country. Now you might say, okay, in a population of 80 million, some 13,000 with weapons or 34,000 are not such a big issue. But we learned the hard way that every single one of them might prepare for an attack and therefore cause harm and be actually very dangerous. One of the very interesting and very dangerous developments that we've seen in the past few years, which is also connected to the new right in the United States, because, as I mentioned before, these groups are very much interconnected with each other, thanks to the internet, thanks to communication platforms on TikTok, Telegram, Facebook, and Instagram, and the various other groups. We're seeing a large amount of neo-Nazis and right-wing and new right groups organizing themselves as the so-called mosaic of the right, preparing actually for a situation where different groups that used to compete with each other among the right-wing subcultural neo-Nazi groups, for once and for all, find their place in the bigger picture, the mosaic, where each and every one of them works together hand in hand. Even they don't like each other, mostly personally. They have one big goal: overthrowing the government, overthrowing the federal state, and reestablishing a dictatorship. Now one could say, okay, we've seen many groups dreaming of many things, but taking the past few years in consideration, we have discovered that they have succeeded very well on their plans. And we in Germany have a so-called neo-Nazi party. It's called the Alternative for Germany, who is not only present in each of the 16 states that we have in parliament, but also in the federal government. And one of the key players happens to live in Thuringia, in the state that I'm responsible for. And in Thuringia itself, we have a situation that these groups gained 28% among voters in the last elections and are still on the rising amount, which means that for once, after such a long time after the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazis in the after the Weimar Republic and the Nazi dictatorship, we're seeing elected Nazis to take seats in our parliaments and use, basically, like Goebbels once said it in a very famous speech, use the weapons of democracy to overthrow democracy. And we're taking a very tough stand, of course, against them, but it's very difficult if you are proclaiming an open democracy to use the weapons of the democracy in fighting these undemocratic extremists who want to throw over our system. And I'm pretty excited to see and share with you how we might succeed in the future. Let me add one more group and one more example of a very tasty situation that we face. Probably sounds familiar also to you in the United States when you think about some of your elections that were manipulated successfully by foreign countries, using actually people on the ground in the United States, American citizens, to overthrow, at least try to overthrow your own democracy and your own political system. We discovered a couple of months ago a group in Germany, which is considered to be a mixed martial arts group, which is called Systema fighting schools, a branch which originated from St. Petersburg in Russia and was spread across Europe, but across the world in the meantime, like a franchise, a company like McDonald's or McFit or whoever you want to call it, Pizza Hut, where you simply spread mixed martial arts sports schools trained by former Spetsnaz soldiers and try to collect new clients, specifically from the police, from the military, law enforcement community, in order to not only teach them mixed martial arts, but also provide them with a feeling that Russians naturally, with Europeans, white Europeans, share a lot more than specifically Muslims and other foreigners who come to Germany as refugees, and create basically a safe haven where you protect each other, share each other's ideals and ideas in order to have troops on the ground for future actions. Sounds like an old spy movie, what I'm describing here, but is a very, very dangerous development, which happened for a long time under our noses. And we know in the meantime that these groups have already been used for violent attacks on the streets. 2014 in Paris at a soccer competition where Russian-speaking hooligans were creating turmoils on the street. In 2016 in Chemnitz in Germany, in East Germany, where Russian hooligans, Russian-speaking hooligans, were creating turmoils and fusses on the streets. And I'm afraid we will see much more of this in the future, when specifically also the Ukrainian war will escalate even more. And as we all know, it is a hybrid war. One of the plans of the Russian government is, of course, to have boots on the ground behind enemy lines and create chaos and therefore destabilize democracies. I'm giving you this example with a small overview to show you that even foreign governments are trying to infiltrate extremist scenes and trying to manipulate those scenes in their order to create the overall goal in destabilizing democracies, governments, states, and at the very end, even to destabilize the transatlantic relationship and to cut loose European nations from the transatlantic relationship to lead it to a Russian-European relationship. That's a little far-fetched if you look at the European hold-up also in the Ukrainian war at the moment. But when you look at Hungary, when you look at Italy, when you look at France with Mrs. Le Pen, there are certain developments, and I could add Sweden. There are certain developments in Europe where already some of the governments have changed dramatically, of course, through elections, so democratically legitimized, but changed from open, prosperous, human, basic rights-oriented governments towards more nationalistic and almost fascist governments who are taking certainly a very different point of view when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and certainly a very different point of view when it comes to the transatlantic relationships. And I think we're going to see some more of this in the future. And I'm not so sure whether we're really good prepared to solve these problems. Talking about Systema, some of you might think, okay, this is probably a German, a European situation, which would never be able to happen in the United States, but I can discourage you and tell you, you have the same Systema fighting schools in the United States. And some of my colleagues at Rutgers University, where I'm a visiting fellow, figured out that even some of your law enforcement personnel are training with those folks. So far, they haven't known whom they are training with, but this is an issue that also put the American intelligence community on high alert and shows very well that we are facing a globalization not only of extremists, but also of cyber war, led by some countries who want to, of course, set a new world order. I want to stop here after almost 30 minutes that I gave you a little overview on those subjects, and please feel free to ask any question you want. I hope that I'll be able to answer it, and if not, we'll discuss furthermore. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience with me and my probably sometimes little itchy English on certain issues, but I hope that I could state very clearly what I wanted to convey to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephan. One thing that we should all know is that this event is co-sponsored by the Martin Springer Institute at our sister institution in Northern Arizona University. So we're thrilled to be co-sponsoring the event with Martin Springer Institute. So let's manage the Q&A session. There's a Q&A box in Zoom. So please just type your questions in there and I'll do my best to get to all of them. Let's just start off with one of the, I think, the most pressing questions for those of us here in the United States, which is to what degree are the right-wing groups that you're busy investigating, sometimes prosecuting, and just dealing with generally on a policy level, to what degree are those groups connected to US groups, and how should we understand here in the US the ways in which coordination, international and global coordination is necessary or useful for this threat?
Thanks, Daniel. That's a very important question, and I gave you some ideas already how they are connected. Digital world as well as in the analog world. I mean, we have neo-Nazis from the US traveling to Germany, traveling to Europe, participating in the various concerts, competitions. We have Northern American, I have to say, Canada is included, neo-Nazis being part of the Azov regiment fighting in Ukraine, meeting German, Italian, French, and other counterparts there. But even worse, we have on the digital world, we have a connection between the new right in the United States and the right-wing groups in Germany. QAnon, of course, a subject that you are very well familiar with. We always thought in Germany that QAnon conspiracy theories is a very American thing, and that actually, Pizzagate and Clinton and the whole story behind that would not really be something to spread in Europe or specifically in Germany. But I have to put you in a new world. The German-speaking QAnon channels on Telegram, on Instagram, and the various other social networks are the second largest after the English-speaking ones. And our scene, which is called Querdenker, it's not straight thinking, actually, if one would translate that into English, starts with a Q, and that is not an accident, but it's more or less a copy of the QAnon idea that is behind this. And the conspiracy theories that we find at QAnon are very much adapted to Germany, and therefore it's a one-to-one copy of a connection between these groups. And I have to add that some of your certainly different seen and managed by the law enforcement and security agencies in the United States, groups from the so-called New Right, who are in Germany and some of European countries considered extremists because they want to overthrow our governments, are people where, very well-known American activists from these groups, I'm not saying any names now, are coming and traveling to Germany, are traveling to Europe and consulting their European counterparts and brothers and sisters, to name it, how they should set up their communication tents, their strategies, and basically giving them advice how they should copy what the American parts did successfully establish in the United States and basically do the same thing in Europe. And there you can see on these various different subjects how close this connection between our activists and the activists in the United States are.
One of the concerns in the US about different hate groups is the degree to which they involve members of law enforcement and the military, and the special concerns of those who've received all sorts of training in the post 9/11 wars, concrete capacity to engage in military and quasi-military activity. Is this an issue that's of relevance in Germany? Is it something that you focus on? And is there any connection possibly between these concerns and groups involved in the Ukrainian conflict?
Another good question, Daniel. Of course, it is a concern because we learn from scandals and catastrophes in the past that we do not only have WhatsApp channel groups among policemen or judiciaries or law enforcement who are providing hate crimes and hate speech among each other, but also being involved in very critical cases where they covered up perpetrators, and this was legally proven in some cases. But we've been trying for the last few years to identify such people among those policemen, military, and other groups, and also the intelligence community. And there were two reports actually published in the last 3 years about our progress of identifying these people and the networks behind. And I have to admit, the vast majority so far from what we see, the vast majority of personnel from law enforcement and security agencies, I call it, are on the safe side. But I wouldn't say that we have already uncovered everybody that is involved in these groups and these sceneries. And you didn't mention at the beginning because it wasn't necessary, but I want to say that I'm also for the last 10 years a reserve officer at the German naval forces, and I'm training officers to be in the naval forces, how they can identify these extremists among themselves in the forces and how they should act against them, and also to educate and immunize themselves to not become extremists when they are certainly approached by comrades or by others from the scene who want to pull them to the dark side, how I call it. And this is a very tough job, and I can tell you, I have other colleagues doing the same. We have a lot more to handle with, and I'm pretty sure the problem is much bigger than we see at the moment.
We have a question here from Michael Hector, professor in School of Politics and Global Studies. Who is funding these right-wing extremist groups? And I think by that question, he might mean those in Germany, but maybe connections between funding in Europe and funding in other parts of the world.
That is a very interesting question because what we used to do is I said, I mean, you guys know the Al Capone case. If you want to deal with those perpetrators, sometimes you have to go, let's say, ways to catch them, which are not the straight ways, but who doing curves and turns. And following the money is certainly one of the ways to identify the networks. And that's what we're basically doing. And it's interesting, those competitions, mixed martial arts competitions, right-wing concerts, are generating a lot of money. We're talking about a concert for one weekend who makes a turnover after deducting the costs they had of €250,000, which floods into the scene again. But first of all, most of those neo-Nazis organizing these concerts are seen as entrepreneurs who are basically making money from the scene. And so these concerts and the merchandise that they do with it collect a lot of money that is responsible for the scene, but this is only part of the story. Some of the groups are dealing in the meantime, and we just uncovered about 3 months ago in Thuringia, another of these groups, a neo-Nazi group who is much more into organized crime, meaning we're dealing with weapons, they're dealing with narcotics, they are dealing with prostitutes, generating a lot of income and using the money not only for their own pleasure, but also to finance the community and finance these groups. And the third part is, and I'm sorry to say that again, but that's the reality, Mr. Putin did not only provide credits from Mrs. Le Pen, but also for various other right-wing groups across Europe. And I'm not just speaking about the political end of this group. I'm also speaking about concerts that were financed. If you want to look on the internet, there is a platform called White Rex with a man called Danis Nikitin, who was a provider and sponsor of various mixed martial arts competitions across Europe. And we have reason to believe that some of the money was fiddled in there from intelligence operations of Eastern Europeans, let's call it a little fancy, Eastern Europeans, but mostly Russian intelligence operations. And that shows very clearly how this money, of course, is not state money that is officially transferred, but the trails are covered, and secret intelligence operations by these foreign operations and intelligence communities are used to finance these groups.
A number of folks in the audience have asked questions about this link between Russia and extremist groups and connections possibly related to the Ukraine conflict. Do you see any possibility or significant possibility that Russia might use its influence and its connections to incite and or support violent attacks in the West?
Look, we have not only seen, but we have proof that to some extent, Russia uses any kind of group that it could connect to for creating chaos and misinformation, which means, and that is kind of crazy if you look at it, Russia, the Russian government connects to neo-Nazis as well as to communists and left extremists. And they don't differentiate, because at the end of the day, any group that they can connect to and manipulate and use as actors on the ground are fine for them. And I give you an example. We had German neo-Nazis that were doing comrade travels to Russia, visiting tank museums and other nice spots in Russia. And I was very curious how Russia, the country fighting against neo-Nazis and fascism in its whole history, could allow neo-Nazis, German neo-Nazis, very well-known German neo-Nazis, to get a permission to visit with a visa the Russian Federation. And I did a little, experiment and tried to find out and spoke publicly about the fact that we had proof that German neo-Nazis were traveling to Russia. And I said publicly to our news agencies, look, there are only basically two options. One thing is the Russians don't know where it's coming, which I don't think, because Russian intelligence is very sophisticated, besides some other stories we learn right now from Ukraine and the war and others. But besides it, I still believe that Russian intelligence is very sophisticated. So they know damn well who's coming and who's meeting with their Russian neo-Nazis on the ground in Russia. And interesting, after this public press announcements that I made and interviews that I gave were aired, it took less than 24 hours and I had the press speaker of the Russian embassy, a wide variety of Duma representatives, even from the intelligence community, Russia TV, Sputnik Radio, NTV, on my neck, forcing me, or basically trying to force me to apologize to Russia for setting up that argument that they might know and support whom they are dealing with. And my colleagues from the intelligence community, national as international, told me, look, Stephen, if you needed one proof that your theory was right, there you have it, because otherwise they wouldn't have acted on that. Second example, the White Rex network that I described before. The guy, Danis Nikitin, who is well known publicly for being the key holder of that White Rex network and sponsorship of neo-Nazi groups, before the Ukrainian war and before he had some problems with some international intelligence communities, was traveling, publicly known, from Berlin, from Cologne to Kiev, and then to Moscow, back and forth, and he himself had neither a company nor any other income, but obviously enough money in his suitcases to provide and sponsor these clubs and these competitions across Europe. And now I leave it to your imagination where the money came from that he was using. And the third example is that the so-called Nazis that Russia is fighting in Ukraine was some of the Azov battalion that I mentioned before. And we're talking about Nazis from Russia, Nazis from North America, Nazis from across Europe that were basically actively fighting at this Azov battalion, and not only fighting at the battalion, but more or less also establishing a political arm and wing of the Azov battalion, taking active stance in Ukrainian policy, being covered by the Ukrainian Interior Ministry for a certain time. I know this is played down right now in terms of that they didn't play a real role, and right now it's more important to have fighters against Russia. But we have some very connected connections between all these fighters on the ground, which are crossing international borders, and some of them are clearly also in connection to Russian groups. Not that we have proof to the last individual, but you can see the communication, you can see the connection, analog as well as digital, to see very clearly that this is not just a coincidence.
Thanks so much. A question here from Bjorn Krondorfer, who's the director of the Morton Springer Institute. Extremist ideology and conspiratorial beliefs are feeding off of various hatreds and fears, such as nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-foreigner and refugee ideas, anti-liberalism, anti-modernity, including Christian nationalism, both in the US and Russia. Are those equal motivational issues, or how would you differentiate between them?
I think most of them are working together in the common goal to basically push and forward nationalism, and connect people who are open to these questions of nationalism, racism, the classical conspiracy theories. And when you look at, for example, the role of the Orthodox Russian Church, not only in Russia in supporting Vladimir Putin, but also dealing with the various diaspora Russian-speaking communities, which we have in Europe, but which you also have in the United States, you can see that these groups and these different motivations are very well connected into that big game of leading to one common goal.
A quick factual question here. Can you repeat the individual's name who traveled from Berlin to Russia?
He's called Dennis Nikitin. If you Google him, and his network is called White Rex, you will certainly find various English-speaking as well as other language-speaking articles about this person, who happens to be, last information's now in Ukraine, fighting on the Ukrainian side, as we know, against the Russians.
Quick question here. Do differences between Germany and the US with respect to approaches to public education and gun ownership produce differences in the nature of right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism?
They do, but you can't really compare both systems with each other. Although we have the same principles, for example, of free speech, but certainly you have a more liberal way to address people who use hatred speech and others, which is much more covered by your principles of free speech. As to in Germany, we have a much tighter rule when it comes, for example, for lying about the Holocaust or infecting the society with hatred and incitement speeches. But this is a very big discussion right now, specifically when we talk about the role of the domestic intelligence, whether we are so-called opinion police or not, which we're not, because we're focusing on those who are using those rights of free speech to basically overthrow the government, which is much more than just claiming that you have a different opinion on certain opinions and free speech.
A related question to your point from an anonymous attendee, you mentioned the internet as a tool of perpetuating hate. Have you noticed any specific red flags that would lead someone down an anti-Semitic or fascist rabbit hole?
As I mentioned before, I mean, the QAnon in German language is very popular. We're talking about 120,000 clients to those Telegram and other channels. And we're trying to monitor very closely what is going on there, not only us, but also the police, because we want to see, of course, as an early warning system, whether we see a radicalization of individuals or groups that lead to terrorist actions then afterwards. But it's very difficult, taking also our protectionist, our data protection laws that we have in Germany, and the abilities of our agencies to look into these platforms. They're full of these people using all kind of language, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, on these networks, basically encouraging each other in their hatred. And as I mentioned before, we had, for example, a case where someone who was very active in these channels about a year ago, and we were on the height of the corona pandemic, and we had orders in public to wear masks. A guy just drove up to a filling gas station, went into the storeroom and wanted to buy a 6-pack of beer. And a student who was behind the counter, basically asked the guy before he would sell him the beer, he should simply wear a mask because it was mandatory. He refused to do so, left the gas station, went back home, as we knew afterwards, pulled his gun from home, went back to the gas station, looked at the cashier, and just shot him in his head, and told afterwards to the police that he felt so agitated and radicalized by what he saw on the internet and on those platforms, that the only escape way that he saw for himself was just shooting the student. This is one example, and I could add numerous others where we can see that the radicalization on the internet, probably in 90% of the cases, does not lead to active analog violence, but those 10% and rising numbers, we see that people get more and more aggressive from what they discover and what they see and how they get fed into their ecosystems on the internet, and basically transform this into the analog world.
Question here from Gordon Marsh. Do you see any relationship between anti-Zionism and the rise of neo-Nazi groups? Do you think that transforming Jews into perpetrators and their enemies into victims makes your work in this task more difficult?
We have seen some cases, but it's not a major wave at the moment. But we're trying to monitor that closely. But I have to admit, most of it takes place in anonymous or covered up chat rooms and areas where we can hardly get access to.
Question here from David Cater. I think this may reference, here in the US, we have one of the questions about rising influence of hate groups is what factors underlie the adherence to these groups. Are they socioeconomic? Are they, the impact of globalization? To what are the driving forces? And David Cater asks, what is the primary basis, ideas from religion to politics, et cetera, that are the motivation for these extreme right-wing realities in Germany?
It's a very good question, because I think that most of the time this hate speech and these platforms are just triggering something that was already there before. As we of course all know, it's a very wise sentence saying that nobody's born as an anti-Semite or as a radical. Society makes people radical or become an anti-Semite or a hater of gay people or lesbians or a hater of Muslims. We have a number of factors that are taking place, and that makes it, for example, very difficult for us. And I proclaim a very hot fall this year because we have a number of different crises that are falling basically onto a society, onto a citizenship, which is already very much, let's say, not traumatized, but basically seeing everything falling apart after the pandemia that we've had with Corona and economic hardship that they've been going through. Although Germany provided a lot of assistance in terms of direct payment and state assistance to the general public in overcoming the economic hardships of the pandemic. The problem is that we're seeing right now an energy crisis. We're seeing an economic crisis. A lot of companies will certainly not survive energy costs and cut support lines, international support lines, which will lead to a higher growing unemployment rate in the coming weeks to see. We will see people that are certainly afraid of the whole Ukrainian war and how it might further escalate. The question of nukes probably being used by someone. The fact that we have the feeling of local and state events in terms of natural disasters, which we had in the last 12 months, where state agencies, catastrophe release, fire engineers and others did not work the way they were usually supposed on organized way and provide help and assistance for people, so-called experiences that they thought they would never make, till the very end that we have to focus and see already starting more immigrants coming from the various parts of the world to Europe, specifically Germany, because of hunger and other incidents around the world that we're seeing right now. So what I'm saying is we have a constellation of stars, how I would call it, which lead to a simultaneous crisis that are coming onto the people in Germany and Europe, which they are not ready for. And coming out of the pandemic, they are certainly not in a situation that they could simply take these crisis scenarios. Different to the pandemic, it's not a virus where you can try to hide in home office or isolating yourself. The energy crisis, the unemployment hits the people very personally, and fed with conspiracy theories and terrible scenarios till the blackout that is currently discussed and it very extensively across Europe. You have people in fear. And as we all know, people in fear are very difficult and very irrational. And that leads to a very highly explosive situation that we will face in the coming months.
We're almost at the end of our event. Do you have any final thoughts for particularly lessons for our country? We're in this tense electoral season, and there's a lot of concerns about, rising hate groups in the U.S. and their influence on our political reality. Any thoughts from your many years of experience dealing with these issues in Germany that are takeaways and illustrations and maybe recommendations for us here in the United States?
Of course, I don't have the answer to the $1 million question, how we can solve all the problems at once. But certainly from what we learned is that, as I said before, nobody is born as an anti-Semite or as an extremist. Our societies are preparing and producing these people. So we should take a moment, sit back and understand what we need to change in our societies to provide a framework, a safe haven, an understanding, love, empathy, and how we deal with each other to make us understood and feel safe among each other, that we're not seeking the consultancy or the so-called simple answers to difficult questions by extremists. And even further, I think we need to understand, and I think America is much further in these discussions than we are in Europe. The internet is a wonderful thing, but there are two sides of one coin. One thing is it's very wonderful because it gives us all the connection across the world, across languages, across cultures and religions. We can share ideas, we can talk with each other, but we need to understand that the digitalization is not just positive. Also, the bad guys and girls in the world are using the same medias, and I doubt that we are already that we have the competency to really use the internet and the possibilities that we have with the internet in the right way. We have too many citizens in each of our countries who feel that they can deal with the freedom of the internet, but are not really capable of dealing with this freedom in order to understand that it's not just wonderful, but it also has a dark side. And one of the things that I'm telling my folks over here when I'm talking about the digitalization and the internet is the first lesson that you should learn is the internet is not your friend. And don't mistake it as your friend. It's a medium. You can use it, but you have to learn how to use it to do it cautiously. This is the few short ideas that I would answer to your question, Daniel. And forgive me if I'm not, again, giving the answer to the $1 million question and put us all in the right situation.
Stephan Kramer, thank you so much for joining us today, all the way from Germany. And thanks everybody who's been attending this event. Next week, we'll continue with our fall speaker series with a talk by Alex Hinton, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. His talk is entitled, "It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US." It's actually the title of a book he recently wrote. It isn't true that all of our events are on exactly these subjects, but they're of concern, and we're thrilled to have such distinguished speakers and glad to have all of you with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well and be safe all.